The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Port Vauban. Standing on my father's apartment balcony in Antibes, watching the light turn the masts of the superyachts into golden fingers against the Mediterranean blue, felt a world away from my life back in Montreal. I leaned on the railing beside Dad, Frank Stocker, retired yacht captain, who swirled a tumbler of amber liquid gently in his hand. He still kept his sextant polished on the bookshelf inside, a silent testament near the framed chart showing Ursa Minor for Finding North. "It's quieter than I remember, Dad," I said, taking in the familiar, yet somehow different harbour scene. Or maybe I'm just used to city noise now.
He chuckled, that warm, rumbling sound earned from decades spent reading the sea and the sky, and the stars. It has its moments, son. Don't let the calm fool you. Even paradise has its undercurrents.
He took a slow, appreciative sip, his eyes momentarily distant.
Funny how old debts have a way of surfacing, even after decades. You think you've settled everything. Then one quiet evening.
He seemed to shake off the thought abruptly.
Reminds me of something that happened a few months back, actually. Quite the commotion.
My interest piqued. "Oh, yeah? Anything more exciting than Madame Dubois forgetting her prize poodle at the market?" I teased.
Dad smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. A bit more, yes. Involved your old man indirectly. And Jim, of course.
He paused, letting the name hang in the salty air. Jim Devereux, Dad's oldest friend, practically an uncle to me. Been through thick and thin, that man and Dad, right back to when they were just boys dreaming of the sea. Now Jim managed Monaco's most exclusive floating palaces while keeping his own sanctuary high in the Swiss Alps.
It all started, Dad continued, as these things often do, with something shiny.
He settled into his chair, gesturing for me to do the same, and began the story. It started, he said, with a visit to Jim in Monaco. According to Dad, Jim had been more stressed than usual. They were aboard the Azure Serpent, a colossal superyacht belonging to a Russian oligarch named Volkov, a name Dad uttered with a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes.
He insists on keeping the Orloff necklace on board, Danny,
Dad recounted Jim saying, his voice tight with worry.
70 million euros of ice, Frank. Security's tight, ex-Mossad chief, the works. Especially after that attempted cyber attack last month. Someone testing our defenses. Volkov just dismisses it, thinks he's untouchable. But he's not the one who'd have to answer for 70 million euros of missing ice.
Dad told me how he'd surveyed the deck, his captain's eyes instinctively checking everything.
70 million?
He remembered saying to Jim.
I'd still prefer a reliable engine and a clear night sky with Cassiopeia overhead any day.
He described noticing the state-of-the-art security, but also how complex systems often have hidden flaws. He even mentioned pointing out a specific mooring line to Jim.
This Fairlead setup,
Dad recalled telling Jim, gesturing towards the stern.
reminds me a bit of Surama. Remember her? My first proper berth as deckhand. Learned more scrubbing her decks than I did on the bridge sometimes. You always had to double-check the chafe points on those Husman builds, especially where the line meets the alloy. Salt water finds any weakness.
He'd apparently bent down to examine it.
Looks a bit worn there, Jim. Wouldn't want her shifting unexpectedly.
Jim, Dad said, had been distracted, muttering about Volkov, but had made a note to have the crew check it. Just an old sailor's observation, Dad insisted to me. Nothing more. A few weeks later, Dad told me, he was sitting right here on this balcony, likely watching the first stars appear, maybe Orion rising depending on the season, when the call came. It was Jim, frantic.
It's gone, Frank! The Orloff necklace! Gone!
Jim had yelled down the phone. The Azure Serpent's vault had been breached sometime during the night. No forced entry, nothing suspicious on the cameras. The only anomaly? That same mooring line Dad had noticed had apparently parted. The yacht had drifted just a few meters, enough to disable a crucial quayside laser grid for about 90 seconds. Just bad luck? A coincidence? I asked Dad now, looking out at the seemingly peaceful harbor.
That's what puzzled the gendarmerie.
Dad said, taking another sip.
Inspector Dubois from Nice. Sharp woman. Very thorough. She called me in, knowing my history, knowing I'd been on board visiting Jim.
He described the sterile interrogation room. Dubois questioned him closely. His expertise was valuable, she'd said.
You were captain for many years, correct?
Dad recounted her asking,
Dolphin, Sulara, Taiyu, and known for your celestial navigation skills, I understand. Using the likes of Polaris and the plow when others rely solely on screens. A dying art.
That's right, Inspector.
he'd replied calmly.
GPS is convenient, but knowing the stars, knowing how to find Polaris, even when the clouds are tricky, that tells you things electronics can't. Gives you a feel for timing, for the rhythm of the night. But I'm retired now. Happily retired.
He told her he'd simply pointed out the worn line out of habit.
And you were here in Antibes all night?
She'd pressed.
Absolutely.
Dad had assured her.
Quiet dinner with Chantel. She left late.
When she pressed him further about the exact timing of Chantel's departure and his own activities afterwards, Dad recounted,
I felt a familiar knot tighten low in my stomach, the same tension I'd felt navigating through a sudden squall near the Azores once. I forced my hand, resting on the chair arm, to remain steady as I met her gaze.
He'd just reiterated his simple evening routine. He told me how Chantel had indeed left his apartment late that night, kissing him goodbye before dashing off.
Madame Bonnet in Cannes needs her injection before midnight.
She'd called back in her rapid French.
These roads will be clear, no? I can make good time. À tout à l'heure.
Fastest nurse on the Côte d'Azur.
Dad repeated the description he'd given Dubois.
Knows every shortcut.
He added thoughtfully,
She sees enough hardship. Understands that sometimes helping people requires unconventional methods.
Dubois, Dad said, had circled the suspects. Volkov, the fired security chief, indebted crew, even Jim.
Jim?
Dad recalled, scoffing, his surprise seeming genuine to the inspector.
Impossible. He lives by the book.
He'd made sure to vouch for Jim, just as Jim, he heard later, had vouched for him.
Old friends look out for each other.
He'd told Dubois simply. Dad described how he'd offered Dubois his perspective, drawing on his long career, the differences between yacht types, crew psychology, harbor blind spots. He talked about harbor blind spots, crew psychology, and even, he mentioned casually, how understanding precise timings, lunar cycles affecting tides, the predictable transit of certain constellations across key navigational points, moments of low port activity, was second nature to someone who navigated by the heavens. He framed it all, he assured me, as general observations from a lifetime at sea. So, what was the upshot? I asked now, leaning forward on the balcony railing. Did Inspector Dubois figure it out?
Dad swirled the last of his drink. She's good, sharp, focused on the crew. Found 2 deckhands who'd suddenly paid off massive debts. Circumstantial, but it stuck. Their alibis for the crucial window were shaky.
So they confessed?
Took a plea bargain.
Dad said, shrugging slightly.
Admitted disabling some internal sensors, taking advantage of the lucky break with the mooring line. Got maybe 5 years each. Volkov claimed his insurance. Probably got more than the necklace was worth. Jim was hugely relieved. End of story.
And you just watched it all unfold from here? I looked around the balcony again.
An old man's pastime.
Dad repeated, his expression settling.
Watching the ships come and go.
He stood up.
Fancy another drink before Chantel gets here?
As he poured me another generous measure, the neatness of it bothered me. But Dad, I said, bypassing the vault's internal security with no trace. Just disabling sensors. And that line snapping at the perfect moment. How would a couple of deckhands manage that level of precision? It sounds... Dad handed me my drink and settled back, looking out at the harbor again. The sky was deepening to indigo. He was silent for a long moment, then turned to me, his eyes holding a different light.
That, my boy,
He said softly, his voice barely above the gentle lapping of the waves below.
is where you learn things scrubbing teak that they don't teach you in captain's school. And sometimes it's where you see the chance to redirect things.
He paused.
Remember Captain Evans, old Welshman, gave me and Jim our first proper berths?
I nodded. The name resonated with respect from Dad's earlier stories.
Volkov
Dad continued, his voice tight with controlled anger.
destroyed him, financially. Hostile takeover, ruined him. Evans died practically penniless. His family, his widow, Bethan, the grandkids, left struggling. He took a deep breath. That Orloff necklace? Volkov bought it practically the day after the deal closed that ruined Evans. Flaunting it, it became a symbol.
My mind raced. So the necklace wasn't just stolen for its value? I whispered.
Value? Yes. But keeping it? Selling it for myself? What's the point?
Dad shook his head, looking out at the gleaming yachts below.
Taking something like that, it weighs heavy, Danny. There was a night or two when I almost talked myself out of it. The risk, the complexity, but then I thought of Evans, broken, Bethan struggling. Good people, decent people, crushed without a second thought.
His voice was low, heavy with memory. He looked out at the expensive lights glittering across the water.
Let's just say,
He said carefully,
that certain unique assets have ways of finding new homes, discreetly, through certain trusted channels.
He met my eye.
Channels that specialize in converting problematic items into untraceable funds.
He paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing, his voice regaining its quiet confidence.
The money now supports families like theirs, a benevolent fund for merchant sailors' families. Evan's widow won't ever struggle again. Neither will the others. Sometimes,
He added, a touch of steel beneath the calm.
justice isn't clean, but it can be right.
And Jim?
Jim knows nothing.
Dad stated firmly.
Absolutely nothing. Plausible deniability. Essential.
He paused.
But taking that specific necklace, Volkov loses a bauble, claims the insurance, a drop in the ocean for him. But the value finally goes where it always should have. He then briefly explained the how again. The deckhand knowledge from Surama, the specific Fairlead vulnerability, the legacy diagnostic code, combined with the celestial timing. That drift had to be exact, he elaborated. The quayside laser grid was aligned perfectly between two fixed points on the dock. It becomes useless if the yacht shifts even slightly off its precise mooring marks. 90 seconds was all it took.
The plan required both intimate technical knowledge and a deep, ingrained understanding of celestial mechanics.
It required meticulous planning, he admitted, and reliable friends. Hypothetically, of course.
I stared at my father, the familiar lines of his face suddenly seeming rearranged, holding a new, complex history. The retired captain, the celestial navigator, the man who could read the stars and the subtle flaws in multi-million euro security systems. My father, the sophisticated thief operating under his own code of justice. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Shock, a flicker of disapproval, but underneath it, a growing, grudging admiration for the sheer audacity, the skill, and the strange, flawed nobility of the motive. How do you reconcile the father you know with the mastermind he just revealed himself to be? Dad glanced at his watch then, his expression relaxing back into its usual calm warmth, breaking the spell.
Ah, Chantel will be here soon. Dinner in Nice. Found another shortcut, she claims.
He winked, the familiar twinkle back, deeper now.
Fastest nurse on the Riviera. Always reliable.
He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. She sees enough hardship, understands that sometimes helping people requires unconventional methods. He looked out over Port Vauban, the picture of contented retirement, yet with an undercurrent of quiet, fierce purpose. The first stars were beginning to prick the twilight sky. I could just make out the familiar W of Cassiopeia appearing high above the darkening hills. Lights glittered on the water below.
It's like navigating, Danny.
Dad said, clapping my shoulder gently.
You need to know the currents, the hazards, the official channels, the modern tech. But you also need to trust the stars, the tides, the things that don't change. Your fixed points, like Polaris. Sometimes the most important destination isn't on any published chart. Sometimes you set your own course, using all the knowledge you ever gained, to get where you truly need to go.
He raised his glass.
A story I'm quite pleased with. Good to know the skills can still serve a purpose. A real purpose.
He turned back to the view, a quiet, satisfied smile playing on his lips. I watched closely as a sleek, dark tender slipped quietly from the shadow of a large yacht near the harbor mouth, disappearing silently toward open water. No lights, no sound, invisible to all but those who knew exactly where and when to look.